Hey everyone, welcome to another episode of Darshan Talks. I have Angela Wagner with us again. We've spoken to Angela twice already about trust and what the implications of trust are, and why is there a problem between pharma and patients in the context of trust. And Angela, what have we spoken about so far?
Well, Darshan, so far we have talked about pop quiz, Sunday night pop quiz. We've talked about benevolence. We've talked about attunement, and tonight I'd like to handle the second set of criteria or constructs of this model of trust, which would be integrity and competence.
So before we jump into integrity and competence, quick summary on benevolence and attunement.
Alrighty, well, let me check my notes. So for benevolence, basically what we're dealing with is behaving in an altruistic manner. It has to be something that is value added. It has to be something that does not give a direct benefit to, in this case, the pharmaceutical company. So it can be negative or neutral, but it cannot have a direct positive effect, such as increasing profits or increasing sales or any such thing. Okay. So that's sort of the quick and dirty benevolence. And then when we move on to attunement is awareness, response, and harmony. It is a two-way street. There must be interaction of some sort between the patient and the pharmaceutical company. It need not be sort of direct, but there should be a give and take, if you will. And it can encompass a show of benevolence, but it is distinct in that benevolence is an intrinsic quality, whereas attunement is sort of an action that happens over time.
Okay. So let's bring up the next portion.
Alrighty. Just a second here. Okay, let me share my screen. Fine, there it is. All right, it thinks it's sharing the window. There it is. Can you see it?
This way.
There it is. Is it large enough? Should it be larger?
No, you're good. It is large enough.
Okay, cool. All right. Well, it should be actually pretty quick. Integrity is a construct that appears in most models of trust. It actually usually appears as integrity or some variation thereof. So it's pretty standard, but it's also very important. So I included it here. In this model, it refers to a set of qualities or actions that suggest incorruptibility. So it includes the idea of keeping a promise or following the law. And actually, keeping a promise is, in the case of Ingenhoff, had to do specifically with CEOs versus the company. And this was an interesting study because what they determined was that people viewed the CEO and the company as the same entity. So from an integrity standpoint, the actions of the CEO reflected directly on the actions of the company and the trust in the company.
So here's an interesting comment that came through, just by the way. So John Irvin says, hopefully patients are learning that 50% of all medical research is non-repeatable. It's a serious issue, and unconscious bias and the extreme focus on revenues over quality outcomes is a major concern. Any comments?
Well, it is a serious issue.
Yeah, I'm agreeing with that. I'm a little unsure if John is saying that patients should sort of see it in should always doubt the research because it's always best to confirm, or is he saying that pharma companies are focusing on revenues and that's a major concern? I didn't know which way he's going on that one.
Yeah, I'm not sure either. The first thing that kind of came to mind is the difference between clinical studies and real-world evidence. Okay. And how there's been more of a push lately to do more real-world evidence, that patients are actually seeing it as extremely valuable, that pharmacovigilance departments are seeing it as being extremely valuable. Everyone agrees that it's extremely valuable. And I have heard, and I can't remember exactly where I heard it, that actually real-world evidence is becoming ever more important, simply because the size of the patient pool is so much larger, and it encompasses so many things that would be confounders in a clinical study.
Such as what?
Well, for example, I was just reading one that had to do with a COVID vaccine study, actually. But, for example, not including people with certain autoimmune conditions in a clinical study because it certainly could affect the results. But you would see that in a real world study, or a real world evidence scenario, just because, you're including everyone who's taking the drug, not just people, who are easiest or, where it makes the most sense to study that in terms of a clinical outcome, no bias, no confounders. At least you hope. I mean, there's always bias, there's always confounders, but you hope that there won't be any.
Fair enough. So let's keep going.
Okay. Let's see. So Injinoff was realizing that, the participants in this study were seeing the CEO and the company as being sort of the same entity, which I found very interesting. So if the CEO kept promises, they would trust. If the company followed the law, they would trust.
Well, so how do you even inform people that the CEO is keeping promises? I mean, wouldn't you assume that most people are keeping their promises? So are we suggesting that every time the CEO keeps a promise, they publicize it?
Oh, no. See, it's always the opposite of that. I've discovered through this, through this study that people only really mention trust when it doesn't exist.
Okay.
If you see trust, and a little bit later on, we'll discuss that, where I discovered actually as a keyword, it is a negative keyword. But in this case, Injinoff also discussed or studied how people got their information. So people who were using a lot of news coverage to get information, they were actually discovering that they were less trusting in general than people who were somehow getting their information other than in mass media. So I can't recall off the top of my head what those sources were, but
Right.
generally speaking, the more mass media people consume, the more distrusting they are. And from just what I can remember off the top of my head, that's where it came from. So where people are, this CEO is keeping promises, it would be whatever the news coverage was. So certainly a sort of a PR.
So
approach.
you remember we talked a little bit earlier about the CEO being the same as the pharmaceutical company?
Mm-hmm.
Here's a comment that John sort of clarified. It says, I'm saying that the research has not been shown to produce long-term effectiveness with some drugs over time, which is true because you aren't always doing long-term studies.
Very true. Very true.
His point goes to the recalls and negative outcomes over time. It is a serious concern. I'm not disagreeing with any of that, which speaks to the need for continued long-term studies.
True.
But I'm not sure the FDA is going to, especially right now, where they're taking a risk-based philosophy. I don't see them taking the position that we're not going to allow drugs onto the market because there's lack of a long-term study, basically.
True.
Having said that, does that speak to the trust that pharmaceutical companies are losing? And is this where the CEO should go? You know what? We put this out there. We just discovered this lack of evidence, and therefore there are recalls and negative outcomes. Or are we saying that is generating trust?
That not saying anything about negative outcomes is generating trust?
No, that going out and saying, look, there are negative outcomes. We found these. We want you to know about it. And therefore that behavior of transparency is generating trust.
Well, does it fit with integrity? Is it considered integrity?
Yes.
It's not exactly keeping a promise, unless your promise is there an inherent promise in pharma that is tied to the welfare of the patient? I think it may not be called out specifically, but we all think it's there, don't we?
Yeah, I would think so.
I think we do. And it's interesting in terms of the long-term studies, because I've actually worked on promo for drugs that did have long-term studies. And what I found is that when they do a 5-year study on a drug, they never stop promoting the 5-year study.
Right.
Right. So, but in terms of, is it increasing revenue? Is it increasing trust? I don't know that that's really been measured.
Or maybe that's just a benevolence thing.
Well, it's possible. It's possible. But trying to remember if these particular studies, if they also had a concurrent study that was going for a new indication, and they might have.
It might have.
But yeah, perhaps it is benevolence, perhaps a long-term study where there is no new indication. But now here's another thing, is with real-world evidence becoming more important, are they going to bother to do these 5-year studies? Is it cheaper just to pull data from these websites like Patients Like Me, like Drug Stars? I mean, that seems to make more financial sense, and the patients have more of a feeling like they're included, like they're valuable, like their information is valuable. I mean, their information is valuable.
Right, absolutely.
So, it'd be interesting to see, does the onus go from the pharmaceutical company to patient reporting?
Yeah.
But sorry, we kind of went pretty far afield
there. On a left turn, but yeah, go back to where we were. Sorry about that.
Sure, but yeah, it's an excellent point. The long-term study versus the real world evidence, and certainly I am thinking of drugs like Vioxx, for example, and how that really erodes trust very quickly. And actually, that would not be within the confines of this particular study, but I think it would be interesting to see what happens to trust once it's, like, how do we lose trust? Do we lose trust, or was it never there? So that would be an interesting thing to look at, later on, I think. All right, so moving along. So keeping a promise, or if you're a company, following the law, or, showing in PR that you are following the law, being obvious about it, that increases trust. Honesty increases trust. And this actually, Hillen had a study that had to do with cancer patients' trust in their oncologists. Right. And what they found was that, and perhaps this has to do with the issue of recalls and et cetera, that even if the oncologist was giving them bad news, they trusted, the doctor more if the doctor was just honest. And they trusted the doctor less if the doctor was, giving a prognosis that wasn't entirely realistic.
Right. So here's a question for you. One of the comments I've seen discussed is trust as a result of something like this, where you're showing objectivity and you're showing some level of truthfulness. Is that necessarily, I guess, how do I phrase this? Is it self-serving, i.e., therefore not beneficial? But more importantly, is it more of a show of trust than actual trust? Does that question make sense?
You mean, is keeping a promise or being honest, is that more of a show?
Yeah.
Okay.
Not just keeping a promise, which you should do anyways, but then marketing it that you kept the promise.
Well, I mean, marketing that you keep a promise. I think if you got rid of that, would you even have marketing anymore?
Right. So that's the question.
Aside from product X does Y, it's, well, look what we've done. I mean, otherwise, how are you going to know as the patient? The patient isn't just going to wake up one morning and go, I just feel that company X is keeping promises. It just feels like they are.
That's the question. That's exactly why I'm asking the question.
So it doesn't really matter if it's self-promoting as long as it's true. But that wouldn't fall under benevolence. That would fall under attunement. And it could fall under integrity.
Okay.
I think.
Okay.
It's a good question, though. So in terms of written communication, which is where I'm, eventually going to sort of prove this trust model.
Yeah.
We've got objectivity, accuracy, truthfulness, and the use of scholarly references. And these references that I've listed here, they all go into how specifically for written communication, these things constitute integrity. So it's kind of cut and dry. It was very interesting. Kotonen, and I apologize if I have mispronounced the name. It's, I believe it's a Danish name or Swedish. Okay. They actually did a study specific to written health information. So that was very interesting, and I was able to pull a lot of information because they were literally looking at copy and using, real participants to kind of rate the copy on its truthfulness. And they found that, accuracy, objectivity, logic, truthfulness, these were really important in having the patient trust the information that was given. And then Bala
But
used,
here's the question: how would the patient even know if the information's accurate or the scholarly references are actually appropriate?
well, actually, in terms of the scholarly references, it was the use of rather than the accuracy of.
Oh, you have
So
accuracy up there as well, right? As a separate factor.
true, true. So basically, did it look accurate? Did they use a scholarly reference at all? So I don't know that they really had time in the study for people to go in, look at the reference, see if it was cited correctly. They probably didn't. And I've read a few different studies that talked about, just seeing that it was there was a benefit.
But isn't that a way to actually lose trust when you start using fake scholarly references? I mean, I can cite the things all the time.
You can, but it would have to come out. And I'm certainly not recommending that people use fake scholarly references. I feel like, among other things, if you're taking the time to cite something, just cite it accurately. How hard is that? Use
It
a
reminds
scholarly
me of
reference.
the I don't know if you remember this, but there was a movie that came out a while ago, and they said something like recommended 5 out of 5 stars, best movie this year, and I want to say Sony or something like that. Sony put that out.
Okay.
Turns out the reviewer worked for Sony, and it was their internal review or something like that.
Okay.
The point being, you can cite scholarly references, but then they turn out to be fake. So it's
True.
not that the source is untrue. It's a
Mhm.
less trustworthy source.
That's true. I mean, but then the patient would have to be educated in what was considered a good source and what was
Right.
considered, not a good source. And actually, there are some organizations that kind of go through and do that. And I'm not sure if they specifically look at your sources and check them, to ensure they're being used properly.
Okay.
But I do know that there are organizations that do trust measurements for websites that have
Okay.
specifically to do with healthcare. I'm thinking of HANCode in particular, but I think there are others as well. So yeah, basically in this case, it was literally just the presence of a reference. And honestly, having looked at a lot of consumer websites related to health, that's a big step forward. Just having a reference of some kind
Right.
is just
Right.
mind blowing, and it shouldn't be, but it is.
Fair enough.
Um, so I don't know if we need to go into those anymore, do we?
No,
Objectivity, accuracy.
I think we've beaten that dead
Okay,
horse.
we've beaten that dead horse. Okay, moving on. All right. Oh, I've just discovered if I'm looking at the main window, I cannot manipulate my file. There we go. Moving up. Okay. So competence. That's interesting too, because I edited that and it's still there. I'll have to figure that one out later. So in this model, competence is a belief, patient belief in the company's advanced knowledge of the subject and the company's ability, as perceived by the patient or demonstrated by the company, to communicate the advanced knowledge in a way that the intended audience can assimilate this knowledge without undue effort. That's kind of a big one to unpack, but notice it's not just advanced knowledge. It's also advanced knowledge and ability to communicate in a way that the audience can understand it easily.
Okay.
And that is something that I think there's a bit of a struggle with in the real world, to make it easy to understand. And of course, that can be a huge undertaking depending on who your audience is.
Again, isn't that attunement though? Because there's a two-way
Well,
conversation.
it's not, because if you put out your website information, it is there, right? You don't have comments. You don't have any way, if you put it out as a Google Doc where the patient can edit your information or put comments on it,
Mm-hmm.
then that could be attunement. But because you've published this information, it's out there, you can read it, you don't have to read it. It doesn't interact. So
Okay.
therefore it is static and it is not attunement, but it would be competence. It can't be benevolence, because it's not. I mean, you could argue maybe it is value added, but if you're in the case of a drug company, you're trying to inform the patient of a condition or about a particular therapy. This is something that you have a vested interest in the patient understanding.
Right.
And it directly affects your ability to, get a prescription into the patient's hands, get the drug into their hands so that they can use it. That affects you directly. So it's not value added.
Okay.
All right. So, and again, the intended audience needs to be able to assimilate the knowledge without undue effort. And what is undue effort? I mean, we could argue about that, but basically, do they easily understand it? Do they need to Google something in order to understand it? Do they need to ask their doctor in order to understand it? Ideally, no. Ideally, they can read it, they understand it, now they will trust it.
You and I have spoken about lay summaries before, right?
About what? I'm sorry?
Lay summaries of clinical
Late
trials?
summaries. Yes.
Okay.
I believe we have briefly.
Yes. So you're required to do that now under various international laws,
Sure.
regulations. The question is this useful in how they design their lay summaries?
It could be, but again, it depends on, who your audience is. So, I mean, the patients, that's a big group of people. It kind of depends on what are the indications, who is the patient population going to be. A pediatric drug, you may need a completely different sort of lay summary than you would for, something that is applicable only to adults or something that's indicated only for adults. And of course, it gets tricky if you've got an adult indication only in one country and you've got pediatric indication in another country for the same drug. Now you've got to do two completely separate ones. That might be challenging.
Yeah.
Maybe important, but challenging.
Fair enough.
So yeah, I think, again, a lot of it comes down in terms of trust, knowing your audience, knowing that your audience could be several different groups of people, and knowing how to communicate in a way that they can understand so they can trust.
Okay.
Okay. Moving on. So a trustor, or in this case, it'd be a company, that, or rather, that should be a trustee. I'm sorry, I better edit that. That can demonstrate or appear to demonstrate a high degree of knowledge, ability, or expertise are considered to be more trustworthy. And this comes from Fisk or Fiske did the study having to do with warmth and competence, where certain jobs were seen as, the people who held these jobs were automatically seen as more trustworthy due to warmth plus competence. And then Hillen, let me look at Hillen again. Oh, Hillen was the study of cancer patients and their oncologists. So, looking like you know what you're doing, looking like you have great expertise, you're knowledgeable. These are obviously going to increase trust, and I don't know that that's much of a shocker to anyone. And then in terms of written materials and web content, which is, of course, also a written material, clearly communicated information will correspond to increased reader trust. And this comes from the study that I mentioned earlier that had to do specifically with health information online. And then the other one is an e-commerce study. But they did discover that, communicating clearly brought about more trust. Any questions on that?
No.
Okay, that actually is kind of where I want to stop on the outline. But there is one more question, which is safety.
Okay.
Now, you will recall, anyone who's watching will not recall, but you will recall that I had safety in the outline. And we talked about it at length. And the problem with safety, while I think it's a really important construct in terms of patient pharma trust, is how do you measure safety on a brand website?
Well,
is it possible?
You're required as a brand website to actually have the safety of the drug on the website.
True, but that's not the safety we're talking about.
We're talking about safety of the patient.
We're talking about, in this case, we're not talking about the physical safety of the drug. That would be competence, right? Okay. Providing the information in a way that can be understood.
Okay.
So even though it makes sense to call it safety, in the construct of this model of trust, safety would have more to do with security with feeling like your information is safe, right? Because we're dealing with a website. So when it comes to web-based safety, we're dealing with health information, we're dealing with financial information.
Okay.
Is that something that we can measure, without needing to get IRB approval? And what I had started doing was looking at how do these different websites set up their patient accounts? Is there any health information that's being transmitted? If so, what kind of information? Because there's very unlikely to be financial information, unless it has to do with applying for a specific program that the pharmaceutical company is running, possibly. So is it possible? I mean, they're setting up restrictions for who can create an account. Right. I looked at, some companies allow a proxy to set up an account. So what if you're a caregiver for a geriatric patient or a disabled patient? Can you set up an account? And that is actually a safety measure. But it's a difficult thing to measure without setting up an account, which requires you to, acknowledge that you are a patient with this condition, which obviously I am not. So legally, I really can't do that. What do you think? Is it possible? Does anybody have a comment? Darshan, what do you got?
I feel like using security and safety as interchangeable. I'm not fully sure I understand the question of is it possible, but I feel like I can't remember where we landed up in the conversation, but it's something that probably can get rolled up into one of the other factors, and that's where we landed up. But talk to me further. What do you?
Well, let me look at my factors here. Well, safety wouldn't necessarily be benevolence, because it could be, but there's also legal protections involved for the company.
Not necessarily. But you're that's I can see your point, but I feel like that is stretching it.
Okay.
Yeah, it's assuming that you only do keep people safe to protect yourself, and it's possible, but it's a really aggressive way of thinking.
True. And I don't know that it would be fair to be quite that aggressive. Right. I'm sure there are organizations that think that way, but I don't know that we want to really acknowledge them as being normal.
Representative, right.
Yeah. Okay, so would it be benevolence? Well, it can't be benevolence, because if you're protecting the patient to also protect yourself, then you have a definite investment, and then it could not be value added.
Okay.
Right? If it's in your best interest to make sure that the patient feels safe or has security, then it can't be benevolent.
What about
integrity? Is it attunement?
I think attunement I kind of jumped over a little bit because I didn't feel like it's enough two-way in there.
Okay. That could be true, although, well, yeah. Let's say you've submitted your health information to a pharmaceutical website. Let's assume that they want some health information in order to verify that, like what if there's a REMS? That's health information.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So you submit that, you have no idea what they're doing with it. So in that case, you're right. It would not be a two-way interaction.
Which leaves you to integrity.
Right. Integrity is, let me go back up. Incorruptibility. Well, security, incorruptibility. I think that is a possibility. It's probably a better possibility than the others, because it's not necessarily competence either. You hope that they will, because that's really, I know and I can communicate.
Yeah.
So, okay, so does safety belong to integrity? It's possible that it does, unless we can find some other.
So is your question, should we add it as a separate point?
I struggle with that. Initially, I did add it as a separate point, and it had the. Yeah, I know. But it had the added benefit of actually making a beautiful acronym. Alas. So I'm not sure. I think we had
If
sort of
anyone's
resolved.
listening and they have an opinion, I'd love to hear it.
Yeah, that would be great if somebody could step in and help in our argument here, or our debate. As I feel like it should be a separate point, although it could be part of integrity. But I don't know, but you think it doesn't. And, it really doesn't matter in this case if I can't figure out a way to measure it on a website.
Yeah.
So it would have to be a separate study, I think. But interesting stuff.
Yeah, for sure. Is there anything else after that?
After that, we get more directly into the original research methodology.
Okay. Should we use that as the next conversation?
That should definitely be the next one. And I think we're going to need to break it up a little bit because it is pretty long.
Okay. So
yeah.
Thank you again. Any last parting words before we... So that was the background of how we decided what we're going to look at and why we're looking at it. So next stage is the original research you're going to do. So stay tuned, listen in. We'll have Angela Wagner talk to us about the original research she's doing. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.